we've obliterated the room for culture, and therefore we're now thrashing around for anyone else that we can project
And
this
you
need.
think chefs have come in?
Chefs are there.
Okay.
We're there. You know,
Right, okay, with you.
We're filling that hole at the moment, but it's something I resist. I don't think we should need our young people to destroy themselves in order for us to feel good about ourselves. I resist the idea of the chef as artist. You know, I think the romantic idea of the artist as a creative genius is completely misapplied to chefs. Kitchens are teams. Kitchens are an organic unit of different individuals who come together to create something much greater than they could create on their own.
I also think it's like the only time you get an hour and a half off, like force off your phone. And it's like afterwards you're like, this is what it could be like.
Yeah. Well, I'm pretty ruthless about my phone. Like I try not to use it at weekends. I try and like not use it in the evenings and stuff like that.
Really, yeah.
And also, I mean, you know, I find like the pleasure of human discourse kind of immensely rewarding, so that, you know, because I don't go out too much in the evenings, but I do try and when I see...
When you say... we're rolling, by the way. So when you say the pleasure of human discourse, like that's a great... You've done my job for me, Jackson.
Like conversation. So,
yeah.
I
got to come a little bit
one
closer.
One of the great pleasures of kitchen life is that, you know, and I think one of the misunderstandings from the way kitchen life is often dramatized in cinema and TV is that actually a lot of your day is standing around doing slightly repetitive tasks, having conversations, you know, and these are lovely social environments. Kitchens are really, really pleasurable social environments. And we stand and chat, and it's fun. You can't really get too deep, because anything that requires you to, or anything that requires of me particularly pointed thought, limits my ability to do fine mechanical tasks. So if I have to think too hard about what I'm talking about, I'm much more likely to chop the end of my finger off. So the conversation tends to be quite light and quite funny, but it is nevertheless a very, very discursive environment. On the other hand, having the opportunity to sit down and actually have a conversation, an interrogative conversation, where someone asks me, you know, what I think about things. This happens very, very rarely. I spend most of the time when I'm not at work in the company of my small children, who are full of fascinating bits of information, but very, very rarely ask me what I'm thinking about. And so to be placed in front of a microphone and interrogated is actually, it's useful. I find it really interesting. I often don't know what I think about things until I'm asked what I think about them. It is also interesting, I suppose. It brings me on to another point, which is something that you raised, or I should allow you to raise, but writing, and one of the reasons I find writing such a rewarding practice, but I find it so hard, is that it's kind of almost the only area of my life where I can't, you know, get away with bullshit, you know? Like, I think in any other instance, if I'm not in the mood to have like a chat with someone, but they come and start a conversation, you know, you can charm your way through it, even if you're not feeling, you know, genuinely, authentically happy. You can put a mask on, you can remain upbeat. And in fact, a lot of daily life is kind of slightly masked, is about kind of conscientiously presenting the most positive aspect of yourself to the world in order to maintain general positive vibes. And I feel like, as you know, the head of a large organization with lots of employees, you know, I do feel that's beholden on me. I'm very, very aware that if I'm not in a good mood and I allow it to show, the psychic ramifications of that for the rest of my team is not good. It filters out. People are affected by my moods if I'm not, you know, if I allow myself to show anxiety or frustration, you know, it's anxious making. And I think it is similar to parenting in that regard. You know, I mask a lot of my anxieties and cares from my children, not because I want to shield them from the reality of life, but just because, you know, I think it is inhibiting. I think other people's moods, especially my moods, which are, you know, I'm an emotional person, you know, my moods are strong. And if I give in to them, they can often have a slightly, I don't want to use the word toxic because it's a horribly overused word, which I think has lost kind of all meaning, but it can have a really kind of poisonous effect on the people around me. So I kind of maintain, as much as it's possible, a kind of as a positive demeanor and outlook in all things in my daily life. I can't do this in writing. When I sit down and I am tasked with kind of expressing what I think in words on the written, in writing, I find my ability to do so is completely inhibited by my determination to only speak entirely authentically. That is, it's absolutely impossible for me to write something that I don't feel is 100% true. And when you actually get into that place, you realize that what you know to be true is actually an incredibly small body of of thought. Like you immediately start interrogating your own thoughts and whittling things down to the very few principles that you absolutely... Guys, we're recording. I'm so sorry. Sorry.
It's all good.
That you absolutely stand by is I do find that very challenging.
Let's talk about writing then. So a couple of things that you said there. I think there's a quote I love by someone who says like writing is like spiritual windscreen wipers for your mind, right? So you've got all this sort of, and I have this myself. I almost have like this force in my head, and if I wake up first thing and write, by the end of it, I've got this sort of force. It can be negative thoughts, it can be nefarious thoughts, it can be positive thoughts, but it's just a lot of fucking shit going on, right? And when I write, a lot of it, you sort of chunder that out, and then you're left with like the brutal simplicity of what you're actually feeling, and having that as a vehicle to put it there before you come in here, and you've got to be the upbeat. Running a group of restaurants is incredibly difficult, but having that sort of if you've got a stream of thoughts, if you can sort of have a little what's it, like a moat or like a slipstream here to channel that thoughts, then you can go on with your day. So what does your writing process look like? Because I mean, I think this is one of the best things. I've got a few of your things you've written about because I think they're beautifully written. But as you said, as cooks, we're always trying to present our diners with food which is unimpeachably delicious. Unimpeachably delicious is just an astoundingly delicious word. But like, talk me through your writing process.
Well, I mean, this is also interesting because I think one of the kind of the complexities of being a contemporary cook is the expectation not only that we can, conceive of and execute consistently delicious foods, can nurture and lead our teams through the kind of various challenges that professional cookery notoriously constantly foist upon us as, things go wrong, things don't turn up, things break down, people, et cetera, et cetera. But also, to be kind of ambassadors for our food and for our food culture to the world via the medium of social media. And I think the way Instagram has evolved from being a purely visual platform of just essentially taking a picture of something and sharing it without comment to being a much more intimate and discursive form where we use pictures really to kind of slightly abstractly illustrate a kind of confessional mode. To where it is now, where it sits as the kind of, neglected, ancestor of TikTok, which is kind of incredibly fast-paced and visually intuitive, and seems to speak in a completely different language, which is a form that I've kind of yet to kind of fully master, but is very, very interesting to me as kind of a definite evolution and novelty. The way I find Instagram useful as a mode of communication is slightly confessional. It kind of allows you the opportunity in concise terms to speak honestly and authentically to a huge audience about what you're thinking about. It doesn't particularly, in my experience, reward nuance or irony, but it does reward authenticity. And I think that's very valuable because I think that actually the written word as opposed to the visual is uniquely good at its precision in distilling complexities of thought into very simple messages. And I really value it for that. I really value it because, again, I often don't really know what I think until I sit down to try and
what are some of those?
it.
Sorry to interrupt, just curiosity's bubbling here. But so, what are some of those complex thoughts that you sort of distilled down into sort of pithy aphorisms or like ways to kind of make sense of?
I think, look, we're all riven by conflict. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, it's not that thought is too necessarily too subtle or sophisticated to be able to express with precision. It's more just that my thoughts are often so in conflict with themselves and with each other that to hit upon what it is that I do, in fact, actually commit to and believe, in spite of feeling inherently contradictory in my various emotional approaches to things. And also to kind of filter that through a kind of, I suppose, an ethical prism, to say, well, I feel this strongly, but I also want this strongly. Those two wants and desires are directly in conflict with each other. Which is my true want, which is my a want which has been influenced or seeded into me by external, external forces, and which is the good one, which is the one that is good for me and good for everyone else, which is the...
Is there an example of that, to add some colour to that?
I think, purely in culinary terms, let's say, but I think this applies to all desire. I think we live in a world of profound libidinal overstimulation where our desires are constantly being tickled. And I think that there are kind of insidious versions of this. I think, there's a huge amount of kind of, there's an undertone of kind of slightly debased sexuality to a lot of culture, which, tickles something, deeply animal and primal in us that we should probably hold in better check. But to avoid getting too deep into sex, I think just to look at food. I mean, the interesting thing and one of the rewarding things, one of the things that makes working in food easy is that, you can guarantee that at some point every day people will be hungry. And at that point, people will also probably be bored, because boredom and hunger often go very closely hand in hand. When people are bored, they reach for their phones. When they look at their phones, they get bombarded with pictures of food. If those pictures of food are pictures of my food, they're much more likely to come and want to eat in my restaurant. So, when we're thinking about how we're seducing people with food, how we're communicating our ideas about what deliciousness is, there is, we know that there are virtuous things to eat, things that are good for us, things that are good for the planet. We know that there are things that are deeply satisfying and rewarding to eat and delicious to eat that aren't necessarily good for us and or possibly aren't good for the planet, right? The choices we make about what we elect to eat, in spite of being attracted to both those diametric opposites, are an example of a conflict being resolved by an ethical decision, And I think that you can in thinking about how we choose to satiate our appetites, which are both real in that we are genuinely hungry, but also artificial in that these are being artificially stimulated by external media. We there as individuals, we need to kind of synthesize those two very opposing forces.
The two forces are like the desire and the actual
they're both desires. They're both legitimate desires.
Yeah.
You can follow one or you can follow the other.
Yeah.
Or you can follow a mixture of the two. It's up to you. But you need to be aware of them. You need to be aware of their conflict.
Yeah.
You need to interrogate that conflict and decide which direction you're going to go in. And I think that there's kind of, that are in our very overstimulated existences, we're having our desires tickled constantly in multiple different directions. And I find the practice of sitting down and writing and trying to determine what I actually think and trying to cut through what is simply a visceral desire that comes from a natural bodily urge, what is a visceral desire that's been imposed upon me by forces beyond my control that I'm bombarded with, and what is, actually the good and right thing to pursue. All of that trio of kind of positions, I suppose, is what I'm thinking about when I'm sitting down to try and explore what I actually think about things.
I suppose writing gives you that space to see things in their own...
Writing is
like slow motion, isn't it?
Writing
right?
is the tool that allows me to see through my own bullshit, essentially. I know when I write something down if it's false, in a way that I don't necessarily know if something's false when I say it, because there isn't enough of a filter between what I think and what I say, because I speak too quickly.
Yes. And then, is there when you say you write something false, talk about that?
Well, no. I mean, I think that anyone who has tried to make a true account of themselves in writing knows very well how hard it is to make a record of what they actually think about something, because as soon as you put it down in paper, you're like, am I happy to send that out into the world as a permanent record of what I think? And you're like, actually, no, because I don't really think that, do I? I mean, it sounds good. I mean, that feels good. It looks good. Yeah, it's a bold statement, but do I really think that? You know, or am I saying this because it's a posture? Am I adopting this posture because it's antagonistic? Is it going to get me the kind of attention that I want? Is it going to incite is it in a kind of a puerile way going to incite some kind of response in people who I don't like? You know, like this is what internet culture is now. This is what most public discourse is. It's trolling. You know, and I think that good writing, it's impossible for good writing to perform like that because so much thought has already put into it. It's already anticipated its own weaknesses, its own superficialities. And deliberately avoids being inflammatory for the sake of being inflammatory by being true instead.
Ernest Hemingway's got a quote which is the first draft of everything is shit, which I just love because it's like it works both ways in terms of like the audience, like the first thing you're going to write down is going to be crap, right? So like polish it up. But I also think it works the other way for yourself. Is like what you first chunder out your head, which could be like, right, I want to go and eat, fuck it, it's back to these desires, a load of cheeseburgers, right? That could be your sort of, your very, as you say, it's sort of, we're being tickled incessantly and stimulated. But then that draft is shit. That's not telling what you actually, the true desire, or not necessarily true desire, but the desire of what you actually want, or is good for you. And
it's also purgative. You know, we need to shit. You know, like we need to purge our bodies of what we don't need, what is no longer valuable to us. And I think that a vast amount of writing that I produce is purely purgative.
So when do you write? What's your sort of process?
Far too infrequently. But because for me, it's the most exhausting form of creative practice that I'm kind of I engage with. It takes more out of me. Sitting for an hour writing takes more out of me physically and emotionally than anything else I do. Everyone's like, "Oh, you work so hard as a cook." I'm like, "No, cooking is easy." Like, you know, it's demanding, it's physical, but compared to sitting and trying to write, trying to kind of like interrogate myself for and trying to kind of squeeze out of myself what I truly believe about things. Cooking, by comparison to that, is so much more simple and straightforward. And I find it exhausting. And I have to, if I am commissioned to do a piece of writing, as you know, I love being commissioned to write things because I see it as such a challenge. And there is nothing that I do that is as rewarding as writing. When I was an adolescent, when I was a teenager, I was, very introverted. I didn't have many friends. I desperately wanted friends. I wanted human connection, but I didn't know how to achieve it. I think as lots of us experience at that age, there was a huge block between the emotions I felt and my ability to put those emotions into words and communicate them in a way that was both understandable and sympathetic to other people. So I felt kind of very stuck within myself. And I found in reading, especially fiction, I was a voracious reader of fiction.
What are some of the just to ask you this is I asked a guy called Will Storr, who's an amazing writer who's written a book called The Status Game, Selfie, How the West Became Self-Obsessed, all this Instagram stuff you're talking about. And he, again, a voracious reader of fiction, and one of the questions I asked him, and funnily enough, he'd actually spent a bit of time in a kitchen, and he had an amazing book about his time working at a two-star restaurant as a and I asked him the question of, like, out of all those characters of the fiction books, so I think we find a lot of ourselves in these characters. I'd love to know what are some of the characters of the books you've read that really, he talked about, I don't know if you've read,
a really good question.
John Fante Ask the Dusk, like that was his, the character in that was the one he related to the most.
It's interesting. I mean, I read, so I suppose the most obvious one would be Julien Sorel in Stendhal's Red and the Black, which was...
What's it called? Sorry?
Red and the Black by Stendhal. And it's an amazing kind of coming-of-age story about an ambitious young man from the provinces of France who has this kind of adventure kind of through the kind of... in the 19th century, kind of from the highs to the highs and lows of French society. It's kind of an amazing kind of social picture of France of that time, told through the perspective of this young adventurer. And I remember feeling a kind of a huge sense of sympathy and identification.
What's the character called? His name's
Julien. Well, my French pronunciation is terrible.
Might as
But,
well
Julien Sorel.
Julien Sorel. Why did you relate to Julien Sorel?
Well, he was a young man with a huge appetite for life, who was a naive, who through his charm and youthful exuberance was able to kind of navigate kind of a huge plethora of different worlds, remaining just a kind of a total. I think at that age I felt both very, very hungry to be independent, to be out there in the world. I mean, this is when I'm like 15, 16.
Sure.
But very, very hungry for adulthood, to be out there in the world, but also very, very scared and intimidated by it. I used to, like that all of those things that you're so drawn to at that age are also kind of slightly terrifying to you. But nevertheless, kind of, I felt, irresistibly drawn to it. I felt kind of drawn towards this world, and I suppose all of my understanding of what the kind of the reality of adulthood was like was through books, which, considering most of the books I was reading were written in the 19th century, was a very kind of strange picture of contemporary adulthood.
Yeah.
In that many of the kind of sexual mores and emotional proclivities of contemporary adults are universal and unchanging, and probably were exactly the same in the 19th century. It's just that the manner of their depiction, the kind of the delicate subtleties with which novelists...
Sorry, 19th century, I'm being so silly here, but 19th century is what?
1800s.
1800s, yeah, sorry, yeah.
So, 18... And the kind of turn of the century, I suppose, was when I was, reading lots. But
so what sort of books were you reading there? Because I believe the future lives in the past, and it's like, you read old stuff, and you're like, oh shit, we haven't changed at all. It's just...
I think there is a total constancy to the way human... I mean, the last 200, 300 years, the modern era, is an incredibly brief period in human history, in relative terms. The idea that we would have evolved emotionally and psychologically so rapidly in that time in a fundamental way, I think, is misguided. I think that the modern circumstance, especially the urban environment, does force certain pressures on us that are, that do force us to contort ourselves into kind of slightly novel shapes. I think that how incredibly dense and overstimulating and chaotic and aggressive cities are is not good for the kind of, the unevolved animal which still resides within us viscerally.
The cities are so new in the grand scheme of things. Like, if you look at the timeline of life, it's like such a new concept.
Yeah, but also, humans have always drawn together. We're social creatures. We're attracted to each other. We've always, we've been drawn into large communities for a long time, and it's very interesting reading about prehistory, the archaeological prehistory and the evidence for, huge, large, proto-urban developments in Mesoamerica, for instance.
Mesoamerica,
as in, the Americas before the arrival of European settlers.
Sorry, yeah, with you, yeah.
Or Mesopotamia, these were large urban environments, full of complexity. I think the idea that the city is a uniquely recent invention is probably not the case. But I do think that the modern techno city is particularly aggressive in its alienating force, and the way it alienates the kind of evolved part of our heads from the kind of unevolved primal animal inside of us, and the kind of duality that therefore is kind of enforced between our intellect and our kind of emotional core, I think is very discombobulating. I feel it. I was born in this city. I love this city. I feel irresistibly held here. But equally, I'm never happy here. I'm only ever happy when I'm outside of the city, when I'm in somewhere peaceful, when I'm in, the countryside, when I'm by the sea, when I'm somewhere very close to nature, where I'm, not engaging with technology. You know, this is the only time I feel like anything close to happiness. Which isn't to say that I can't experience joy in cities. I feel excitement, I feel stimulation, I feel joy, I feel companionship.
What's the difference between joy and happiness to you?
For me, I can be joyful, but I can still be unhappy. I can be excited and delighted, but I can still have a persistent sense of dis-ease.
So interesting, because I interviewed the founder of Gales last week, Tom Molnar, and he literally said there's a difference between happiness and joy. And he said you can find happiness, but he said joy comes from doing hard things, because there's actually a sense of like fulfillment from it being hard, whereas happiness could be having a pint with your mate, or going for some dinner. But I think that they are two different things, and it's just the texture of each is different to each person.
Completely. I think happiness is very, very hard to achieve. I think happiness comes from living a good and balanced and well-ordered existence. And happiness is, for me, actually, if I'm going to be totally honest, for a long period of my life, I resisted happiness because I found it boring. And I actually was almost proud of the fact that I was never happy, because for me it was, stimulation and challenge and dynamism were more valuable and admirable to me than living in happy balance with myself and with those around me. That has shifted a lot, especially as I've become a much more conscientious parent. And I now see that actually being happy is a very important lesson to show my children, and very good for them. If I'm happy, they will be happy. If I live in balance with them, they'll live in balance with themselves.
It's such a juxtaposition, hospitality, because you're making other people happy, but you yourself didn't. You felt that kind of internal. What was your desire at that point? Because you said you resisted happiness.
I think from the outside we think that hospitality is about making people happy at a cost of our own happiness. I would actually say that yes, probably in my 20s that's how I pursued it. I think very differently now.
Yeah.
Now I think hospitality is about creating moments of joy for our guests, but we can only do that if we're happy ourselves. When I was in my 20s, I was completely obsessed with making sure that my guests were delighted by everything that was going on and happy all the time and showering me with praise. I then aged out of that and started to actually feel very suspicious of that. I was like, that's pure ego. That's just about my own validation. And actually, for the last period of my 30s, essentially, my preoccupation has been much more about how do I make my team happy? How do I create an environment in which my team feel proud and happy to be doing their jobs and get huge satisfaction from that? Because it's only then that they will be able to go out and create a space in which our guests will be able to experience joy, because they're walking into a space where everyone who works there is proud and happy, and also serving them from a position of confidence and self-ownership and collective enthusiasm. And when those things combine, you create a very, very magical ecosystem in which just to walk into that space is to feel the sense of warmth and energy wash over you. And I see it. I experience it myself. I can go to, and I think this is, you can ask anyone who eats in lots of restaurants professionally, but, I go to a lot of restaurants, or I certainly used to. I don't necessarily have as much time anymore. But, in the course of my life, I've been privileged to go to an enormous number of very, very successful restaurants, 3-star, 2-star, whatever, 50 best, and some of them are very good. Some of them they're all very impressive, but there are ones that are impressive. They're impressive machines without having a shred of human joy present in them. And actually just being vehicles of neurosis and anxiety. And I think that...
you don't have to give the name of the restaurant, but describe what that feels like.
I think everyone knows the experience of walking into a highly regimented environment, which is absolutely preoccupied with the need for total precision and consistency in delivering an output of high-end cuisine, but which in doing so has lost all ability to communicate genuine warmth and happiness through that. It is very, very hard to cook and operate at the top level, and it does require a ruthless commitment to consistency and organization in order to achieve that. And in very many cases, that comes at the cost of human warmth. I have also had meals where the foods, you walk into a place and all they do is a bowl of pasta and a plate of cured meat, but everyone who works there is having a great time, is very proud of what they're doing. And the moment you walk in, you feel that communicated to you. And for me, that's a much more soul-enriching experience. Which isn't to say that I don't revere the higher echelons of fine dining. I have huge admiration for it. But it just is something that I think, because it doesn't privilege human joy as its first and foundational principle, in many cases, for me, is generally, in most cases, less rewarding than less rarefied dining experiences.
I interviewed Ashley Palmer-Watts at the Devonshire the other week, and I talked about, there's a quote I love, which is, and it will link to you with your writing, Jackson, but it was Quentin Tarantino on a podcast, and he says the pen is the antenna to God. And by that, I think he is in the context of the creative God, right? So when you start writing, I feel when I write, at some point you sort of feel like you're connected into some sort of flow, and it's sort of coming through you, or as you said, you're sort of purging, right? I'd love to know the difference between kind of the pen as the antenna to the creative God, and almost like you're cooking your pans or your knives as the antenna to sort of the gastronomic God. Like how does the creativity differ between the two? Because you said writing is the hardest creative endeavor you'll do. I'd love to know how writing and food differ in terms of where that creativity comes from.
Yeah, for me, they're reflective of a kind of a dualism in man, which is between the intellectual and the emotional. For me, both are languages. Writing reflects language as spoken and written language, which ultimately attempts to use words to symbolize abstract concepts in a precise manner so that we can communicate with complexity and also legibility. What is clear to the meaning of the words as I intend them to be used should also be clear to you. Otherwise, it's worthless. If the word does not mean the same things to us, it's either the wrong word or it's not a good word in that circumstance. And so I think there's a kind of a philosophical imperative for the written word and the spoken word to mean something that is, if not concrete, because obviously words have shifting meanings, is at least, or has at least got the capacity for a certain precision which allows them to be useful in communicating abstract concepts from one person to another. Food defies this in some ways. And one of the reasons I find it so interesting as a medium in which to work is that it is marvelously irreverent when it comes to philosophy, when it comes to abstract thought. It does not care for these ideas. It does not communicate. I'm deeply suspicious of any attempt to foist some kind of philosophical program or some sense of romantic artistry onto cooking. For me, cooking is a mechanical process where we take raw ingredients, which someone has grown or fostered or loved or nurtured or whatever, but we take them and we collectively use our hands. We engage in a tactile process of transforming that raw ingredient into something delicious. And the amount of work and love and labor we invest into that has an animating quality. It takes the raw ingredient and it animates them with human intention and human love, so that to eat that food is to take that love into yourself.
Wow.
And it has a marvelous and completely, an extraordinary, almost poetic quality of being able to communicate far more than it carries through this kind of animating principle of human emotion. And I love that about food, but it's completely different from words in that regard. Words carry the burden of all of human civilization on their back. They are here to account for our entire collective intellectual history, to be both a record and a constantly changing reflection of the reality of human knowledge and understanding. And they only work if we agree that they have some kind of concrete, symbolic connection to what they're supposed to be representing in the world. Food does not. Food is simply, it's a vehicle for the emotions of the person who is preparing it, to be understood, to be ingested, and to be appreciated by the person who then eats it.
The word you've said that sometimes the word is kind of, you just sort of dropped it into my head, but it makes so much sense now with sort of lucid clarity, is the word, you can animate things. You can animate, the food is almost a vehicle to animate your emotion and pass it through to the end consumer, if you want to call it that, or the person in your restaurant. Let's use that as because I want to talk about Orasay to Dove. So you've got that part, which is taking food, animating it, and then that's the sort of the the feeling you're passing on to someone, which is kind of a story that can be shared with someone else. I think that's kind of what great restaurants do. On the one hand, on the other side of this, we were talking before we hit record, is like a restaurant has to make money. Or a restaurant could be, as you said, it
can't lose money.
It can't lose money. Exactly. So if we could talk about those two things.
I mean, first of all, I hope this isn't going to be disappointing to your audience, but I am not the person that you want to turn to for business advice. I have a long history as an operator, but I never got into this to make money. And I've never been particularly motivated by it. And I've never been good at making lots of money. I have friends who are very good at making lots of money, who are very interested in money and pursue it, and it seems to come to them. I sadly was cursed with an almost kind of total indifference to money for money's sake. But I do have an incredibly finely tuned survival instinct, which means I'm very good at not losing money. Yes. As soon as I think I'm losing money, I get absolutely ruthless, and I have almost my poor accountants suffer. As long as they're sending me nice, positive numbers, they can't even get a meeting with me. But the moment they send me a negative, they can't get rid of me because I suddenly become fascinated on a totally granular level with where the money is going through the business, because it suddenly speaks to my ability to. It suddenly speaks about our ability to survive. With Orasay, it was interesting. I mean, I opened Orasay in 2019. It was a much smaller restaurant than both Brunswick House and St Leonard's, which I just opened. And it was a really interesting proposition. It was, a friend of mine, a really good friend, who was not in restaurants but had invested in a restaurant, and then had been abandoned by the other investors, kind of out of, because he was the only kind of decent individual around that table, kind of paying the bills of this place that was being very badly managed, while working. I mean, he had a full-time job of his own. He was not equipped to deal with that. So he asked for my advice and whether I would help him to get out the weeds. And so we went into partnership together, and we gave it a lick of paint. We reopened it. And very quickly turned it into a very successful operation. But it was much smaller than my other restaurants, and I needed to impose some kind of creative limitation on myself in order for the idea of taking over a small dining room to be stimulating enough to make it worthwhile.
What were some of those creative limitations?
Well, basically to be a restaurant that was only about serving line-caught dayboat British fish and shellfish, which was something that I loved, and one of the kind of weird quirks of our island nation, that while we have like the most, one of the most formidable maritime histories in the world, we are not a great nation of fishies.
History, so I don't know what that means. Yeah,
a history of seafaring.
Okay, sorry, with you. Yeah.
Britain's dominance over the world was largely predicated on the strength of its navy. We're an island nation who's always caught fish, always sold fish to the world, but we don't any longer eat very much fish ourselves.
Sure.
Or understand fish, or know how to cook it. Equally, we have a great deal of some of the best fish in the world that we do export everywhere else, because, line-caught Cornish turbot, Scottish langoustine, diver scallops, these are, in our little pool of water, this is some of the Hebrides, the Irish coast. These are some of the best waters in the world, and as a result, we export these to everywhere. But we don't necessarily appreciate them ourselves. And so I had this idea that actually to have this small dining room where we were only working with this one thing, and because we were small, we could only work with this one thing, because actually this is a very elite product and there's not much of it going around. But a small dining room was probably sufficient to deal with that. We could have a relationship with a small number of individual boats and fishermen and buy directly from them. And in working in this very direct way, we could have access to this kind of very elite product, but not have to charge a huge amount of money for it. And hopefully, find a little niche for ourselves in the London dining landscape. What I don't think we prepared for was how successful Orasay became, and how far in the age of Instagram its influence was able to spread through the world, till we found ourselves, really, while half our audience would be, from our local area in West London and other bits of London, often most of our guests would be from overseas, especially China, especially lots of Americans, lots of Australians, but a huge amount of guests from Asia, which was always very gratifying. It just meant that our restaurant turned into being this place which it was never intended to be, where we had to invest a vast amount in not only making sure that we had a strong kitchen team, but also an incredibly large floor team for the size of the restaurant, because first of all, we were working with a product that was quite obscure. So, for instance, people would walk into a seafood restaurant expecting to be able to order cod or sea bass, but we would only work with sea bass if it was during the season where it's able to be caught. We would only work with it from boats that were using lines to catch it, and we had various criteria to make sure that what we were working with was the best product. So if we couldn't get that sea bass, we'd have something else. We'd have pollock, we'd have gurnet, we'd have any one of a number of other really fantastic and interesting fish native to our waters. Problem is, most people haven't heard of these, and so suddenly you have a menu where of the 20 items, 15 of those items are obscure even to natives of this country, let alone people who are operating in their second language. And so we'd have to invest a huge amount, first of all, in training our floor team about the complexities of what we were working with. Second of all, we had to pay them to stand there and explain the menu in detail for about 10 to 15 minutes to each guest, so that they knew what to order. And all of which was incredibly rewarding. But increasingly hard to justify as a restaurant that was not a fine dining restaurant and not charging fine dining prices. And actually, if you have 10 servers serving a room that only seats 40 people, you need to be charging, 150 to 200 pounds a head for your food. Otherwise, you can't pay all their wages. And, London is an expensive city with the best will in the world. Even if you were a skinflint and didn't want to pay your staff well, you'd have to pay them at least a considerable amount in order to be able to afford to live and work in London. As it is, we believe that the future of this industry is in its professionalization, is in paying people really well for that work. One of the terrible things that has happened to this country, well, one of the many declines in this country, is the fact that, traditional well-paid jobs such as, law or teaching or healthcare, which require training and which require dedication, are no longer at all well paid. And it's remarkable how many of my incredibly talented team are in fact trained as lawyers, because they can't actually get well-paid jobs as lawyers, but they can get very well-paid jobs in hospitality. Nevertheless, we believe these jobs should be well-paid. The problem is, if you set up a system which requires too much labor for too little guest spend, it's not going to work. And I think the fundamental reason that Orasay was not sustainable was that we were not able to put up our prices, or we did not feel comfortable putting up our prices in line with how much more expensive restaurants had become to operate. And that's not labor. That's largely the cost of utilities, largely the cost of ingredients, largely the cost of rent, going up and up and up and up. Orasay is a small restaurant with tables that are quite close together without table linen. It's very, very comfortable and it's very beautifully designed, but it's not luxurious in the kind of ostentatious and aspirational sense of the word. It's luxurious because everything there is beautifully made and everything there is very special. But it doesn't scream, 5-star, that kind of aesthetic that encourages people to spend upwards of 200 quid a head on dinner. And we didn't want to be that restaurant. The problem is we could no longer afford not to be that restaurant. And so we had a decision. We either pursue being that restaurant and put all our prices up and try and aspire to be a fine dining restaurant, or we simply acknowledge that the dream that we had of being a small restaurant working with elite produce, with an incredibly focused and driven team, but crucially doesn't charge ridiculous prices, was no longer sustainable in London. And that was really the decision to take what had been Orasay, and instead of trying to bastardize it in one way or the other, either make it too expensive or gut the product by working with farmed fish or whatnot, we felt that the only sensible course of action that was respectful to the legacy of Orasay was to draw that chapter to a close and to think of a new direction, which, would hew closely to most of the same principles, would work with the same quality of produce, would cook with the same level of flair and imagination and wit and deliciousness, but crucially would remove certain obscuring factors that made Orasay so incredibly challenging to run. So,
what are some of those obscuring factors?
Well, I think the first one would be, for me, menus can do two things. They can either stimulate a conversation where you say, wow, this all sounds very interesting. I've never heard of any of it. Can you explain what all of these things are? Or it can solicit your appetite. You can say, wow, that all sounds delicious. I could eat all of that. I wonder what the best thing on the menu is. Let me ask the team. For me, one of those questions takes 10 minutes to answer. One of them takes 2 minutes. And I think in this day and age, being a restaurant where you're demanding 10 minutes from each of your floor team for each table is not practicable unless you're charging significantly more money than we currently are. So it was like, okay, cool, let's think about things that we know people like eating. And I had this experience. I was invited to go cook in New York in November, and I went to work with a fantastic restaurant over there called Claude, which is, opened a few years ago, has done incredibly well. So much so that they've just opened another restaurant on top of their current restaurant called Penny, which is also amazing. And New York is a city not, with all of London's strengths, but fewer of London's weaknesses. It has a booming economy. New York is kind of roughly the same size as London, roughly the same density. There's not a huge amount in it, but it has an absolutely booming economy because unlike the UK, it didn't engage in a enormous act of self-sabotage with Brexit. It's found other ways to do that, perhaps, but we'll see. That remains to be seen. But nevertheless, New York is a booming economy in the way that London simply isn't at the moment. And I was there and I was cooking there, and I thought, wow, this is going to be so fun. I'm going to be so inspired to be in this very, very positive, optimistic climate. Unlike London, where everyone's moaning the whole time. And you know what? They had exactly the same problems we did. They had, they were still, really struggling to get people, even in this very successful, very hype restaurant, they were, struggling to reconcile the cost of operation with what people are prepared to spend there. They were struggling to, get guests to engage with the value of really good produce versus what they were used to spending on cheap produce when they bought produce for themselves at home. The kind of sticker shock of finding out the distinction between a supermarket chicken and 100-day-old, organic plus chicken from a beautiful farm somewhere, is massive. But, we are not shopping in supermarkets. We're not shopping at the bottom of the food chain. We're buying the best of the best. And they were, to find that in New York with its very wealthy and very much less economically anxious clientele, they were still having the same issues, was salutary. And I came back with this thing that I was very impressed by in New York, which is that even the very cool, self-consciously cool, edgy restaurants were incredibly comfortable with having food on their menu that was kind of quite obviously crowd-pleasing, having some variation of a Caesar salad, having a really good cheeseburger, having a really good roast chicken. They did not consider themselves above doing slightly obvious things that we know people want to eat in a bid to retain a sense of niche obscurantism. And I think that, this was kind of revelatory to me in as much as I felt like, wow, a huge amount of restaurant culture and the restaurant culture I grew up in was niche. It was necessarily niche. It was subcultural. It was an idea that, we are deeply invested in this world, this kind of punky world of authenticity. We know all about natural wines from regions you never heard of. You will like these wines too when you know as much as we do, but you won't because you will never be as deeply invested as we are. But we will share that knowledge with you because we're generous and kind. We're not going to be too cool to share it with you, but we're never going to let down the sense of our own superiority for knowing more about this. And I think, it is interesting. I mean, I certainly grew up in an era where, the internet didn't exist. And if you wanted to get into an underground form of culture, you had to invest in it. And it was deeply rewarding. If you wanted to know about underground hip hop, you had to go and hang out in a record shop in Soho and listen to a pressing that had just come in on vinyl because it wasn't even on radio here and you couldn't stream it over it was, if you wanted to get into drum and bass, you had to hang out in a record shop, especially if you were too young to go to raves. You had to wear the clothes. You had to try and fit in to just pick up little scraps of information that gave you access to these fascinating worlds of deep cultural resonance. And I think that, to a certain extent, the food culture of the 2000s and 2010s was indicative of that. We were cooks, we were wine people, we had deep knowledge of obscure things you hadn't heard of, but that were really cool and that you would find exciting and delicious, and which, crucially, there was a lot of cultural capital in knowing about.
Why did you... I read somewhere that you said, and I thought it was a really interesting piece, about how kind of chefs have supplanted rock and roll stars, and that you said, there's...
So just to be clear, I was resisting this idea. I was saying...
Okay.
I feel, for that, ever since the days of Margot, there's been this desire to project onto professional cooks a romantic iconography of, the Byronic kind of flame, you know, that kind of youthful vigor that burns too brightly until it expires. And you know, and the rock star, the kind of, you know, whether that's, you know, and I feel this is kind of pernicious. I feel that this is misguided. I feel it's completely sensible. Culture needs these figures. It needs these scapegoats. It needs these beautiful young people to reflect the burning, authentic passions of youth that we can feel stimulated by, feel attracted to, feel drawn to, but also ultimately, you know, find kind of... you know, in seeing them burn themselves out, find also a kind of a salutary social lesson that encourages kind of conformity. And I think that this is very misguided. I think that, first of all, chefs have more than enough on their plate without worrying about being rock stars. I think also, you know, the fact is, if we want rock stars, we should allow rock stars to exist. You know, the fact is, when I was growing up in London, every single pub had a room where you could gig in the back. London was full of squats where a group of young people could live and very cheaply and jam every day and work in pubs and gig in bars. And, you know, there were 10,000 bands for every good one that made a success. But nevertheless, it was a thriving ecosystem of you know, rock and roll. That simply doesn't exist anymore. Big cities like London and New York can no longer produce rock and roll bands.
That's what I was trying to. The thread I was trying to pull at is why do you? I think with the vacuum of less amazing bands,
we've obliterated the room for culture. We've obliterated the room for culture, and therefore we're now thrashing around for anyone else that we can project
and
this
you
need.
Think chefs have come in.
Chefs are there. We're there. You know,
right,
like
okay, with you. Yes.
Yeah. You know, it's like we still exist. So we've become we're filling that hole at the moment. But it's something I resist. It's something I resist, and it's something that I think reflects poorly upon us. I don't think we should need our young people to destroy themselves in order for us to feel good about ourselves. And you know, I resist the idea of the chef as artist. You know, I think the romantic idea of the artist as a creative genius is completely misapplied to chefs. Kitchens are teams. Kitchens are an organic unit of different individuals who come together to create something much greater than they could create on their own. You know, when I opened Brunswick House, it was tiny. It was 10 seats. It was that counter there, and it didn't look like this. It wasn't a bar. This was a big shed full of Lascaux's antiques. It was full of bathtubs that they were repainting and chandeliers they were rewiring before they went into their showroom next door. And I had this corner here, and I had an old second-hand coffee machine. I had a fridge from Argos. I had one induction hob, and I had a semi-functional Blue Seal turbofan oven, which I bought second-hand. And I was the only member of staff, essentially. I mean, you know, I did all the cooking. I had, you know, a couple of people who'd come and help make coffees, but, you know, essentially it was me on my own, and that lasted for a period of 18 months, and it was wonderful. It was exhilarating. I was 23, 24. You know, I felt so charged by what I was doing. It didn't matter that no one ever came. You know, you know, in commercial terms, it was a disaster for the first year or so.
What sort of stuff were you cooking at that point?
Mostly sandwiches. Again, this is going to sound completely absurd. Of course, no one came. The star item was a bone marrow sandwich.
Sounds delicious.
It was absolutely delicious. It was whipped bone marrow, seasoned with horseradish, spread on toasted focaccia with a very, very punchy watercress salad and pickled walnuts, and it was absolutely delicious. The office workers of Vauxhall could not have been more baffled by the idea as a concept or as a reality. There was a very good kind of essentially a meatloaf sandwich made of a very good French-style terrine with cornichons and mustard. There was a very good aubergine terrine that we made, a pressed aubergine that was kind of dressed with a kind of crispy chili oil, kind of Central Chinese style crispy chili oil. It was a really fun, creative menu of sandwiches that probably actually looks like quite a lot of what gets served in all of the very fashionable sandwich bars that London sees now. But at the time, you know, our competition was Pret and Tesco's next door, and we couldn't compete with either of those on price or accessibility. So I was just trying to be interesting. I think we were probably a bit too interesting for Vauxhall in those times. But the big change that happened for Brunswick House was we found that the building used to be a working men's club, and still had a kind of a lapsed alcohol license, which Lambeth very graciously pretty much waved through when we applied for it to be recommissioned. And so suddenly we had a reason to start opening in the evenings. And Vauxhall may not have been a hugely thriving area during the day, but it, you know, there were a lot of people living around here, a lot of people living near enough to want to come and eat and drink in the evening. I only knew how to make one drink, which was a Negroni. So that's all the only cocktail we did. and I didn't really know how you price these things, so we put it on for £5. It turns out that doing a £5 Negroni was certainly more compelling for people than a bone marrow sandwich, and we were very, very full very quickly as a result. And then the menu evolved slightly, and I was doing things like terrine and toast, grilled sardines, merguez sausage and lentils, very, very simple plates. Kind of slightly in the style of St. John Bread and Wine. I feel like that was a place that I had a huge amount of kind of. I remember, I think it was probably still when James Lowe was the head chef there, but I was really, really captivated by that place. But I was on my own, and I think spending that long period working on my own, feeling the great exhilaration of doing it unaccompanied, but also fundamentally the loneliness and the boredom of doing it on my own.
I have that and
the limitations. There were so many things I just couldn't cook that I wanted to cook because I only had two hands. And so ever since then, I've had a very, very deep appreciation that, sure, you can be one sole individual, but there's so little you can do as one person, and there's so much you can do as a team. And so this idea that chefs are these unique creative visionaries kind of leading a team of acolytes, for me, I'm sure there are some cases where that's true. I've never eaten in a restaurant which I found wholly rewarding, which subscribes to that. But, it is necessary, it's evidently the case that there are some places that operate on that principle. However, that's not my ethos. My vision is that it's a collegiate team of individuals, all at different skill levels, all at different parts of their career, but all of whom are similarly committed to producing a shared vision of what they think delicious food is, and all collectively investing in that to create a really beautiful experience for their diners.
Such a refreshing lens or just approach and way to look at it, I think.
Well, it also takes a huge amount of pressure off me, I'm going to be honest.
Now, a quick shout out to our wonderful sponsor, Square. If you're a restaurant or you're in the food game and you're thinking of diving in, hear me out. Because running a restaurant, it's not just about great ingredients and it's not just about great vibes. It's payments, staff, menus, online orders, and that's where Square comes in. Their tools are built to make all of that smoother, faster, and let's be honest, less of a headache. Square is the all-in-one restaurant tech system with almost everything you need for day-to-day service, designed to give business owners time back to focus on what really, really matters. With Square, you can manage your business from anywhere, all from one platform, which gives you access to your sales, your bookings, orders, staff management, inventory, and reports. Whether you're a leading fast-paced quick service restaurant or a full-service kitchen, Square lets you spend more time doing what you actually love. Square's purpose is economic empowerment, being the best digital partner through intuitive, beautifully designed tech so their sellers can create the best possible customer experience. Visit square.com to learn how they can help you take your business to the next level. If you're a challenger brand that's absolutely killing it in D2C, but you're struggling to crack retail, then you've got to listen to this. Maybe you've got an Ocado listing, maybe you've got a Whole Foods listing, maybe you're absolutely killing it in Selfridges, maybe you're absolutely killing it in your farm shop and your indies. But my friends, making the leap, crossing El Chasm, crossing El Rubicon to grocery retail is not easy. It's the Champions League of FMCG. It's super hard. It means playing at a higher level, and that's where so many amazing brands sadly stumble. Look, retailers want stories backed by data, not dreams, and a pretty pitch deck. And let's be real, supermarkets are not just going to magically make a space for you and your little brand. They need data. Something's got to go for you to get in, for you to get on shelf. And that is why I've got to tell you about North Star. They are the team that's helping purpose-led FMCG brands go from gut instinct dreams to unstoppable pitch decks that actually unlock retailers. North Star are not like another data company that force feed you data like foie gras, that act like a NASA space mission. It's super, super simple to use. Their team are amazing and they actually get the challenger mindset. North Star are your shortcut to smarter decisions, stronger pitches, and investor confidence, all built specifically for challenger brands like yours. You don't need a massive sales team, you need North Star. Link in the show notes, click that link and you'll be able to book a free demo with North Star. Highly, highly recommend that, and thank me later. I'd love to know what are some of your favourite words, and then what are some of you believe like words that best represent the way you cook at your various restaurants? Because the word I can't maybe pronounce it, but unimpeachably, I think, is just a delicious word. I don't know where. I think that was in reference to Lyle's. I think you were talking about that.
I am interested in the idea of deliciousness as an objective concept. I mean, I kind of feel like the more I get to explore of the world's cooking, and London is a fantastic place to explore the world's cooking. It's one of the most diverse cities in the world, and notoriously, if you want to eat well in London, you leave Zone 1 and 2 and you go and see what's being cooked, in the places where the rest of the world lives, which haven't been hollowed out by developers.
Such as?
Well, discovering Korean food in New Malden, discovering, the plethora of different subcontinental cuisines in East Ham, where you can eat Kerala food, Sri Lankan foods, food from Bangladesh. Each place on the street has like a different speciality of its incredibly rich, culinary heritage in relation to the region that it emerges from. The fact that London has become such a kind of have such a huge population of students from China, all of whom have allowed this flowering of regional diversity in Chinese cooking to the point where it's actually very hard to find traditional Hong Kong style Cantonese cooking in London anymore. Used to be that Chinatown was just Cantonese Hong Kong chefs. Now there's almost none of them left. The closure of HK Diner has left a gaping hole until the 8 opened a couple of years ago, which is somewhere I really like at the moment. But, generally speaking, London has an incredible diversity of food to be eaten. And it's a wonderful place to explore in that regard. But it does, every time I do eat this food, I'm just like, well, this is just delicious, isn't it? It's kind of delicious in the same way that all food is delicious, and that kind of that's an idea that I find kind of very, very liberating in terms of my own kind of cooking. That is a truth. That deliciousness is a truth.
Deliciousness is a truth.
There is, and I think that this probably comes from a sense of guilt that as a young cook I was guilty of playing with culinary ideas that I found interesting, but didn't necessarily find delicious, but persisting with them anyway because I thought they were interesting.
Is there an example of a dish that kind of
my early experiments with fermentation were not good. Before I understood that in order to ferment things well, you needed a scrupulously clean environment. Not that kitchens aren't clean, but that you couldn't take a vegetable, just give it a quick rinse and then expect it to ferment nicely. You had to really carefully clean it, make sure you weren't taking any dirt with it. But crucially, you have to leave the skins intact because they contain the ambient bacteria, which is going to stimulate the fermentation process. You have to use filtered water. You have to use non-iodized sea salt. These were all things that in my early experiments with fermentation, I did not understand and led to some very, very murky flavors emerging through the process that I thought were supposed to be there. I actually personally, I have an appetite for those flavors. Although I don't drink, when I used to drink, really quirky, weird, funky natural wines, I always found fascinating. I like weird flavors, but I also crucially don't believe that those are innately delicious or should be irresponsibly foisted on unsuspecting members of the public. So, my own personal taste, I do not expect to be everyone's. I'm always looking for where my personal taste intersects with what I believe to be universal good taste. Where what I find interesting and supple and responsive to my very particular interests, also clearly has a scalability in that, 99 people out of 100 will taste it and be like, you know what? That is delicious.
That's delicious.
That is delicious.
So we've got delicious almost is the apex of everything you're trying to
100%.
cook.
Yeah.
What about some of these other words, and we maybe talk about for other restaurants, say here versus Dove, that you'd think
the other thing that preoccupies me with food is authenticity. And authenticity is, I don't use authenticity in the way that most people seem to use it, which is in relation to whether it's truly reflective of the cultural heritage of a cuisine. To me, I'm not particularly interested in those ideas because this is I grew up in London where with such a great diversity of cuisines in my face and in my nostrils that I find it very hard to distinguish one cuisine from another in some ways. You know, I respect culinary traditions, and when I go to a country, I love exploring and getting deep on that. But in the place where I live and where I've always lived, all of those things are constantly intermingling. And just like having several intermingling smells at the same time, it's very, very hard to extract one strain from the other, especially when in tandem and in confluence, they're all very delicious. So, you know, I'm not particularly interested in authenticity in terms of reflecting the true and distinct culinary heritage from which a cuisine emerges. Where I mean authenticity, I'm talking about an emotional authenticity, which is that essentially food can only be happy to eat if it's been truly happy to cook. If food is pleasurable to cook, if the experience of cooking that food is an enjoyable and rewarding one, then the food will have an authentic joy at its core. And will inspire authentic joy in the diner. And for me, this is a big preoccupation because it's completely what, you know, this is either, and I say this to everyone who wants to come and work with me, I say, you know, this can either be the best job in the world or the worst job in the world. It's the best job where we all come together, commit ourselves to doing it as a team, support each other. And what emerges from that kitchen is therefore, a synthesis of all that positivity. It's the worst job in the world where you're divided, where you all come in with your own problems, where you are resentful of the job and the guests and your colleagues, and you are constantly trying to find fault with yourself and with the other people around you. And as a result, you're bringing a sense of embittered resentment to what you're doing, and you're not enjoying it. And I see my job ultimately as being creative, the kind of environment where the expectation that people will enjoy it is fair.
How do you do that though? Because I suppose that's the riddle wrapped in the enigma, isn't it? About how you get people to. There's a difference between Seth Godin taught me this. There's a difference between authenticity and professionalism. I.e., so say someone's feeling really shit, right? They're going through a horrid time personally. Or the word authenticity can go, you can pull at this in many ways. If someone comes up authentically to work thinking, I feel like shit, and they're just moping around like this, there's that part which you don't want, but you want the professionalism where people come and they bring their do you see what I'm saying?
I completely understand. So I would say in response to that, that I got into cooking because I was a very depressive individual, that I was naturally predisposed towards depression. That I was a procrastinator, that I was lazy, that I'd always done too well at school without really trying, so I'd never learnt the value of hard work, that I was very stuck within myself because my head moved too fast and I couldn't put it into words, that I had a huge amount of energy, but I had total fear of expressing it because I was a perfectionist, and I worried that if I didn't do something that was brilliant, I'd be mocked. I as a young man, I had all of those insecurities, and kitchens were, the saving of me. I was finally in an environment where I was given simple instructions, and all I had to do was fulfill them. And if I fulfilled them, not only was the process of fulfilling them tactile, fun, and physical, which made me happy because it was completing tasks. It was also using my hands, not being stuck in my head. But it was achievable, like get your head down, work hard, pick those herbs, chop those vegetables, and we'll get there, But crucially, it was unavoidable. Lunch will start at 12 if you're ready or not, so you better be ready. If you're not ready, it's going to be hell for you. It's going to be hell for everyone else. Get ready. And that sense of mutual obligation, the sense that if I do my part, everyone else will do their part.
Yes.
That sense that we were doing something as a collective, not as individuals, therefore we will be judged as a collective, not as an individual. That sense that, in fulfilling our obligation to our team, we're fulfilling an obligation to ourselves. All of which was remarkably valuable to me in dragging myself out of a thinking that was purely preoccupied by my own mental well-being and seeing my mental well-being in the context of the group. Seeing that having a shared commitment with other people and putting aside my own feelings of inadequacy and taking a leap of courage would allow me to be caught up in the group, supported by the group, and crucially, remove that kind of affliction whereby we can't see beyond our own nose because we're so tortured by our own sense of unhappiness. And look, if someone comes to me and says they're unhappy, of course, take the time you need. Let's fix it. Maybe you're burning out. Take a week off. We'll arrange some that's all doable. But if you don't come in today because you're not feeling great, sure, you might feel better in a few hours, but the rest of your team, who you're not turning up for, are going to be left in the shit, and then they're going to be miserable. And if you turn up, 9 times out of 10, after spending an hour or so in the context of the group, working in that sociable environment, getting on with it, you will feel better. Now, I know that from personal experience. I can't force that and I can't insist upon it. But I will say that having spent a lot of my life on and off medication to try and treat myself for the way in which I find life hard, for the way in which I torture myself with my anxieties and my unhappinesses, and how debilitating I found that at various points in my life. And having for the past few years lived, blessedly without the need for any more medication, because it had very, very undesirable side effects on me, which I really didn't want to perpetuate. I stick by that. I'm not saying that hard work is the cure for depression. I'm absolutely not. But I am saying that the work that a kitchen engages with is a remarkable cure for a lot of the malignancies of modern life.
Well, it links back to what you said at the beginning, which was so beautiful about there's almost just because you're cutting something, you don't want to cut your finger off. There's that sort of almost the jazz of conversation where it's not too intense. So it almost sort of softens your mind, and there's a lot of sort of music and camaraderie. But it's like you can either sit at home in a pit of self-pity, or come here, show up. Lunch services at 12, and it pulls you out of the depths of despair, I think, which is wonderful.
Look, cities are hard, alienating places. They get us stuck within ourselves. They fill us with senses of anxiety and insecurity. This is a pretty human condition anyway. It's a kind of Promethean exchange that with the gift of consciousness.
Promethean exchange, sorry.
Well, as in, we stole fire from the gods. We stole, the Prometheus myth is that you steal fire from the gods, and that we've stolen something divine,
right,
which is consciousness, which is our intelligence, which is our wit. We have taken this, and our curse is self-consciousness. Our curse is the doubt that we inflict upon ourselves. We have the capacity to look on the world with an incredibly judicious and critical eye and navigate the world in very sophisticated ways. Unfortunately, we spend a lot of time imposing that upon ourselves, which leads to enormous, huge afflictions of self-doubt and inadequacy. That's the trade-off. And you often find this, the smarter people are, the more they tend to inflict their smartness on themselves in very destructive and debilitating ways. For me, the simplicity of cooking, the simplicity of social cooking, the simplicity of standing in a kitchen surrounded by people who like you, and engaging in this collective act of making delicious food for other people to enjoy is a huge tonic to those problems. And I can't repeat this enough. I am not saying that depression is cured by professional cooking. I am just saying that a lot of the most iniquitous effects of modern living in the way that we live now, and the way in which it can make us so unhappy by its nature, and almost as its purpose in some ways, are alleviated by coming together as a group and playing. Cooking is play. This is what people don't understand about cooking. People are like, it's so stressful, it's so hard. No, it's not. It's play. Yes, team sport is stressful and hard, but it's play. It's fun. Go and look at kids in the playground. When I pick my kids up from school, they are not they're having fun. They're playing, but they are taking it so seriously. They're so invested in the worlds that they build for themselves, and it fills them with so much satisfaction to play in this way. And that's what professional cookery is. It's very, very serious play.
It's like these kitchens in this big sort of metropolis, these sort of mini tribes where people get to play, and it's like the human condition. If you're in a tribe and are playing, it's kind of, because I've had my run-ins with sort of nefarious mental health things in the past, where you just overthinking. Your brain turns into sort of a just crazy washing machine of thoughts. And I know a lot of founders, I think there's a sort of, not always, and I think it's a bit reductionist and a brash statement to sort of, or broad stroke brush, to say that like everyone's who starts their own thing has their own sort of mental difficulties, but there is a kind of common theme, and a lot of people speak to me about this.
I think everyone does. I mean, in my experience, a huge amount of my job is pastoral, is caring for the people who work with me, not because I'm particularly good at it, just because I'm 10, 15 years older than most of them. There's a big misconception in the general public that I had this thing the other day. I was advertising for a job on social media, and it was for a sous chef.
I saw that, yeah.
On like 44K. And someone wrote to me and they say, okay, you know, I know you're a good guy, but 44K isn't a lot to raise a family and buy a house. And I said, how old do you think a sous chef is? And they said, oh, probably 40, 50. And I was like, no, a sous chef in my kitchens is about 28. Right, that's the average age of a sous chef. You enter kitchens in your late teens, early 20s. You're already very experienced after 2-3 years. You can run a section. As long as you want it, you want the responsibility. By the age of 28, you're a sous chef. The average age of a head chef across my kitchens is between 28 and 30. By that point, you're on 50 to 60. You know, good money. If you actually compare what chefs earn, what young chefs earn, relative to the average earnings of a Londoner of the same age bracket, it's an incredibly well-paid job these days. And it should be, because they work hard and they do amazing work. But, you know, actually, because of the physical demands of it, most people age out of it by their mid-30s. They're stepping up into executive positions, or they're taking on consultancy work, or they're going into development, or they switch careers entirely. But, you know, I think there is a misconception that this is something that people get stuck in for life. Actually, most people who work for me are under 30. And as a result, I take enormous pride and pleasure in helping them navigate the challenges of their lives. Not because I know more, but just because I'm older and have already done it. And, you know, they come to me with these questions. I think that, you know, what you said about, you know, these problems being kind of universal to people who've risen to the top of their professions, I'm sure that that's true, but I think actually the reason is that it's universal to everyone. I think the thing is that you're probably just interviewing people who are prominent.
Sure.
You know, I think if you were to interview people who are less prominent, you'd probably find them having exactly the same problems, because I think these feelings are just profoundly universal to the human condition.
And what if, because I know and we don't have to go there, so you can tell me to fuck off happily, but you've talked about your struggles with sort of addiction and cocaine, and sort of that fast-paced, frenetic lifestyle. Talk to me about like the rock bottom of that, and how you pulled yourself out of that.
So I mean, I have when I enjoyed my 20s a lot. I made the fundamental error, though, of misunderstanding that my adolescence, my teens and my early 20s were a stage of my life and not adulthood. You know, I think when I was in it, I was like, okay, I'm an adult now. This is how adulthood feels. It's very intense. It's very extreme. It's really fun. It's full of big highs and big lows. And this is, I'm alive. You know, this is a really authentic experience of being alive. All those people living those square lives, they're just scared. You know, they're limiting themselves. This is what real life feels like. And that's how it felt for me at the time. I think what no one explained to me is actually I'm going to age out of that, and that by my late 20s, my body, you know, I will be slowing down. I will be looking to find a balance. I will be looking to establish a more like ordered and calm and peaceful existence. But I had kind of conditioned myself to not only fear that, to see that as some kind of death in itself. I was like, you know, that is, you know, you live at full pace until you die. Anything less is a compromise or a surrender. And I was really kind of, I think, deeply committed to this as an idea of how one should live, of what the authentic and good life was. Naturally, my very hedonistic existence, which was all about the pursuit of my own pleasure, really, which was kind of, again, fine when I was in my early 20s and didn't have much responsibility, but increasingly not fine when I was, you know, responsible for myself, my family, you know, the people who work with me, was also undermined by the fact that what I was pursuing for pleasure was no longer giving me pleasure and was making me very unhappy. And I got very, very stuck in a very adolescent mindset, I think, and very committed to it. And to the point where, you know, I'm going to be really frank here, you know, I knew I was very unwell. I knew I was very unhappy. I was having constantly having very, very dark thoughts.
Such as?
Self-destructive thoughts, you know, because I was so kind of riddled with unhappiness and shame. But I had no desire to change my path, because for me, anything different would be would be a betrayal of my values, I suppose.
Yeah.
And I just thought I was cursed with this. This was me. This is who I was. To live any other life would be inauthentic. So I need to follow my destiny into an early grave. I think it was also harmed by the fact that I was living in in restaurants. I didn't feel that I had any. I wasn't aware of anyone who'd got clean. I wasn't aware of anyone who'd, everyone I knew and looked up to still had a very wild life, and it was something that always drew me into the industry. And I just kind of didn't think I could stay in the industry if I didn't stick to that. Luckily, happily, I eventually, got to a place where I was so unwell, so unhappy, in such turmoil that I was, I felt very aware that I had the opportunity, having made many failed attempts to stop drinking and stop taking drugs, that, I had this moment of clarity where I was like, fuck, this might be my last chance. I'm very, very unwell. I'm very unhappy. I'm having very dark, self-destructive thoughts. If I carry on down this path, I know where it's going. But I'll give it one last try. I'll just give it a shot. I'll see if I can do it. And I will think radically. I will quit my job. I will change careers, whatever it takes. I went into recovery. I started going to AA. I started going to NA. I went to a meeting every single day for the next 6 months. I immediately discovered that there was, in fact, loads of people around me who'd done the same thing, who I just was ignoring. Lots of people got in touch with me. Phil Howard, John Spiteri, figureheads in the industry who, reached out. Phil I didn't know, but he heard and he was just like, "Look, I'm here for you. Give me a call. Let's have a coffee."
What did he say to you over the coffee?
Well, we shared experiences, and found, a lot of it was just about finding a common bond. But he essentially reassured me that it was possible to have a future in this industry without pursuing that life, which is what I needed to hear to make it possible. And I stuck at it. And I am, hugely relieved and deeply grateful to say that I've managed to make it stick for the last 6.5 years. I don't think there's any value, either personally or publicly, in sharing the more salacious aspects to my wild years. It's something I try and avoid talking about because I don't want to glamorize it. Equally, while I did many things during that time that I look back on with regret, hurt people who I love and betray, let people down, and I feel shame about that. I also, I feel like I learnt pursuing excess and learning its limitations is a good life lesson as well. And I certainly learned the limitations of excess. I feel now that, the role I take seriously, I suppose, is less as an evangelist for total sobriety, because I think that everyone needs to find their own path. And in fact, if I'm totally honest with you, I wish I could still drink. I miss drinking terribly. I still find it hard not to be able to drink. I don't miss drugs at all. I don't miss that life. But I do miss wine. I miss being able to sit sociably with my friends and enjoy a glass of wine. It's a hole in my life, but it's one that I'm committing to maintaining because it's given me so much in return. And I think that what I hope is that I can at least be an example to young people who are struggling to imagine a life without it, especially in this industry, are worrying that if they do stop, they'll have to quit their jobs and find new careers, and they don't want to do that because they love their job. I hope that I can show them that there is a path where you can do both and actually find the job much more rewarding for doing both.
The bit you said earlier, Jackson, which I thought was incredibly profound, and I said, everyone in interviews got their own sort of malaise of problems in their own head. And you're like, actually, that's just people I've interviewed, and it's actually a universal thing. And you said your role now is to sort of help people because you're 10, 15 years ahead. I think there is a lot of people who are feeling that internal malaise, right? And you've gone through some really hard parts, and as I say, I wasn't trying to get into the sort of salacious debauchery. I was more trying to shine a light on how you pulled yourself out of that. What are some of the 1, 2, 3 ways, as you said at the beginning, you're kind of you can veer towards depression. Like, what are some of the ways you pull yourself out of that now that could help a lot of people?
So, ultimately what gets me out of bed is my responsibility to the people around me. If I don't come into work, the anxiety that will create in my team will be far worse than anything I'm feeling. My personal anxiety is worth a lot less than the anxiety of the people who rely on me, whether that's my team or my children. And my sense of obligation to the people I care about is ultimately always, first and foremost, the thing that if I wake up in a particularly dark frame of mind, which sadly I often do because I carry an enormous amount of anxiety, I sleep very badly as a result, I work long hours, I have the best life I can have under the circumstances. I exercise as much as possible. I eat very well.
What sort of exercise gets you going?
I run.
Yeah.
For pleasure. I swim whenever I can. I do weights now and again for resistance. I'm not a gym guy, but I enjoy exercise. It makes me feel good. I have to force myself to do it because I'm lazy, but I feel good afterwards, and I know it's good for me, and I'm disciplined. I'm a very disciplined person. But look, ultimately, our sense of mutual obligation to the people around us is what will save us from our own demons. Every single negative thought we have the capacity to give into in our heads, which distracts us from reaching off the full potential of a brief, remarkable life on this planet, inertia in the face of all that potential due to insecurity is kind of the worst waste of a life one can imagine, right? And ultimately, it's not enough to say that. Like, the way to put that into practice is to not think about yourself, but to think about other people, to think about what you can get by giving, by sacrificing for other people, by being of service to other people. And for me, that culture of service, not to our guests, but to the people around us, is what is so kind of fundamental about, making this, one of the most deeply rewarding ways to spend my life I can imagine.
Let's talk about Margot Henderson. She's been on this podcast. She's wonderful. And I read again, wonderful writing, Jackson, but you said, Margot taught me how to get shouted out without bursting into tears. She showed me how to work hard on no sleep and remain absolutely confident in the clarity of your own vision. She's an absolute force, an incredibly talented cook, but with the most extraordinary drive and tenacity behind that. I utterly revere her. What are some of the underrated pieces of wisdom Margot taught you that are so good that you'd probably pass on to your own kids?
I mean, I learned so many things from Margot, and I still do. She's someone I have huge reverence for. Margot really opened my eyes to the fundamental value of tenacious hard work. And, Margot Woods, I've never known anyone, to really seize every opportunity life presented with them with the same kind of enthusiasm and vigor. When I was working with her, she'd often, she'd not only work incredibly hard cooking for people all day, she'd then sit down with everyone after the meal and keep the party going, and then she'd dance, and long after everyone else had cleared up and gone home, she'd be keeping it going. And then she'd be the first in the next day, and her ability to produce incredibly delicious foods on very little sleep was just unworldly, extraterrestrial. But she had this kind of commitment to both sides. Like she also understood her obligation as a hostess and a host to keep the conversation going, to keep the sense of fun going as well. I mean, it's really a huge amount of my life in my early 20s was trying to live up to the very high standards that she showed me. And in all honesty, I wasn't capable of it. I burnt out, and she's remarkably not only kept going, she's kind of gone from strength to strength. And I have.
When you say what in terms of helping people play, or when you said those high standards,
look, she's what she's built at Rochelle is incredible. The Three Horseshoes is incredible, but she's not only maintained raised her kids, she's kind of maintained an incredibly rich social life. She's looked after Fergus through his kind of his health struggles. She's a really, really kind of formidable person, and I just love how strong her views on things are, how strong her opinions are, and how clearly her personality is expressed in her cooking.
Yeah, we'll begin to wrap this up in a sec. A few more things, mate. That's all right. When you said express her personality through her cooking, like how do you do that?
I mean, it's very interesting, isn't it? I'm very, very I feel like I'm the person who has least access to my own personality. I would not be able to describe it would feel weird to have to describe your own personality, you know? I know what the experience of being me is. I know how it feels to be me. But I think that probably the experience of me is very, very different to the actual people around me. Partly because I'm very conscious of mediating myself for their benefit, as in, obscuring a lot of the kind of more tumultuous emotions in order not to destabilize the people around me. But also because, we're all cursed with a certain amount of vanity and the inability to see ourselves clearly in the mirror. And I think we all have ways that we hope we are seen by the world. And I think there are ways that we probably know we're seen by the world that we would probably rather not have articulated. It's that kind of terrible curse of listening to yourself described by someone you like, without them knowing you're in earshot. Even if you're being described affectionately, it can feel enormously treacherous. I remember once overhearing my dad describe me in very loving terms, clearly speaking about me with reverence when I was a teenager. But I felt so wounded to hear him, talk honestly about where he thought I was good at things, where he was scared I struggled with things, that, I felt so, and it was said with so much love, but I still felt this kind of, huge sense of kind of deep, felt utterly thrown by this,
Sure.
So, having a clear, I don't know how useful it is to know what our personality is. I think we know how we respond to things. I think we know what we're good at. I think we know what we're excited by. I pursue my enthusiasms. I mean, I think my personality, if it's anything, is defined by maintaining a hugely positive outlook and disposition towards life by exclusively pursuing the things that inspire and stimulate me, and scrupulously avoiding anything that depresses and bores me. And this has positive and negative effects. It's why my accountants find it so hard to pin me down and get me to sit in a meeting or read a spreadsheet. It's why my managers tear their hair out that I'll never sit down and sign all the contracts I'm supposed to do, or read long emails and make decisions about business strategy. But it's also why I feel like I'm the best boss I can be, which is to say absolutely not perfect, but at the very least a force of, positivity and enthusiasm within the business, because, really I privilege entirely the things that I enjoy doing, which is cooking, over the things that I don't enjoy doing, which is reading spreadsheets.
And I love what you said there about I don't necessarily know my personality, but Margot is great at putting her personality in our food. Earlier you said, what we're doing is we're mechanical, we're taking different ingredients and we're animating them.
So Margot has a very, very complicated personality, as most brilliant people do.
Yeah.
I think that her food, in its boldness, generosity, warmth and soulfulness, reflects all the most marvelous sides of her nature. I think, she's also, she's fierce and ferocious and daunting, and that actually isn't true of her food.
Daunting, how so?
Well, she's got incredibly strong opinions and is very, very and likes conflict. And I really love that about her. I love getting into an argument with her about things we disagree on. But she's still someone I'm scared of very few people, but I'm still very timid around Margot.
Yes, yeah, it's interesting because she was saying to me she'll say to the chefs at Rochelle, is sometimes don't make it too perfect. She'll go in to be like, you've made that too perfect. And she was kind of saying
terrifying.
Yeah. She's like, yeah.
That would terrify me.
Yeah. What the fuck do you say to that? It's yeah. But it's interesting just seeing the two different ways you kind of operate. You said once that if you're a chef and your job is to cook people dinner, your world is so much bigger than the food world. I'd love to know who are some of the most interesting people you've met or come across on this wonderful journey.
One person who I think deserves a mention I had a brief academic career. I spent 2 years up at Cambridge reading English before I got very bored and moved back to London to ultimately pursue cooking without finishing my degree. I loved it I loved it for both years. I loved reading. I loved having this thing where I just sat and read all day. It was amazing. I had a few very, very inspiring teachers there. One in particular, but they all completely dropped out of my life when I left. Obviously, they were very disappointed in my failure to live up.
Did you drop out after 2 years?
Yeah, okay. Failure to live up to their expectations. But Pete Zabolla, who was the head of English at King's College, Cambridge, where I studied, who was of all of them the man I had most admiration for. Suddenly turned up in one of my restaurants must have been about 10 years ago now. So after not seeing him for probably about 15 years, or maybe less, but whatever, about a decade in between, and announced himself to me. He said, "You might not remember me, but I'm Pete. I taught you at university." I said, "Pete, of course I remember you. It's amazing to see you." And we, formed an amazing friendship. He's one of the most brilliant, interesting, eclectic minds I've ever had the pleasure of engaging with. And we then, having revered him as a young student, we became kind of good friends through the medium of food, which is something he knows vast amounts about. And he's he's an incredible cook. He's a better cook than I am, no question. He's just one of the most.
And you found this out after you?
Yeah, subsequently.
Oh, wow.
One of the most naturally gifted and talented cooks I've ever had the pleasure of engaging with. To the point, and that for me has been I've met many famous people. I've met many prominent people. I've had fun hanging out with them. But actually, it would be very boring to just name drop at this point. But the most meaningful connection I've ever formed with someone through cooking is this man, Pete Zabolla, who's retired last year, and it was my great honour to cook his retirement banquet at Brunswick House. And he had a big symposium in London where academics flew in from all over the world to read papers.
What sort of stuff had he written about, or like what's his work?
His specific interest is. Well, he has many interests, but one of his specific interests is the Sublime within romantic, literary, and kind of artistic theory, and where what this is about, really, what the human experience of engaging with the Sublime signifies, which is something that I find just endlessly fascinating, because it challenges every single atheistic, materialistic assumption I have. It's a whole topic of conversation for another time. But anyway, I cooked Pete's retirement banquet, and we had academics flying from all over the world to honour him. And I cooked this menu for him.
What did you cook?
So there was a course of turbot with sauce. It was very classic. Turbot with sauce vin jaune. Roast beef with a very, very delicious bone marrow jus. There was a really fun challenge. He said, "I don't like puddings. I just would love a really good chocolate sorbet." And I was like, "Look, my chocolate sorbet is good, but it's not the best. I'm gonna make the best chocolate sorbet." I spent about 2 months making chocolate sorbet every day until it got really, really, really good. He said it was the best chocolate sorbet he'd ever had, which made me very happy. That for me, to form a meaningful connection like that with someone who I'd had so much reverence for as a young man, who'd felt so kind of utterly stratospheric in terms of their intellect and their wit and their knowledge. And then to form that very, very direct and authentic connection through my cooking. And then equally to find out that they were also an incredibly gifted cook, more gifted than me,
wow.
But still liked my cooking.
Yeah.
That was probably more meaningful than any famous chef I've ever cooked for, or any famous actor or musician that I've ever had the pleasure of meeting through my cooking. And probably will remain so, I hope, and for a long time to go.
Quickly on the Sublime, because I was speaking to Nina about this yesterday, about Marcel Proust and Proustian moments, those moments that I think he says about the sweet smell of madeleines in a Parisian bakery, and I think there's something about food that gives you that sublime moment where you start really not even just living, but experiencing it. Everything's in 3D and high definition, and I think you can get that with food. But what's Pete taught you about the Sublime, and how does that sort of link to food? How do you think food has a role in the Sublime? Because I think it does, but I just would love to get your take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I feel that I've never had a Sublime food experience. And it's not that I don't believe it's possible for some people.
What's your definition of Sublime first?
So the Sublime is where we're exposed to a moment of artistic wonder, where the universe opens up before us and we feel a deep and intimate connection to a kind of a fundamental higher reality of existence, which is not immediately apparent in the material plane. And, for instance, there's the implication of feeling both a sense of oneness with everything, but also a sense of profound insignificance. And it can be achieved through the contemplation of death. It can be achieved through meditation. It can be achieved through a particularly resonant sunset. It can be achieved through music, I think. Music has a sublime capacity, for sure. And I think art does, and I think poetry does. And, art, poetry, and music are three of my great preoccupations outside of food. They are the kind of, they're my kind of real personal pleasures, when my children are asleep at night and I'm on my own. And I fill that time listening, exposing myself to new sounds and reading
What
poetry.
music do you?
I did what I think lots of people do and stopped listening to anything new at about the age of 30, and suddenly realized this a couple of years ago, that I was still listening to the same records I listened to as a teenager, because as an adolescent everything I heard hit like so fucking profoundly, and I was no longer able to feel new things in that way, so I just listened to old things that yes, in Proustian terms, had this nostalgic capacity to reconjure a period of my life where I felt things incredibly keenly. I've since realized that this is just due to a failure of imagination on my part, and that I should just work harder. So I listen to a lot. I listen to I listen to like NTS radio a lot, stuff like anywhere where I'm going to be exposed, not necessarily to new contemporary stuff, but new anything. Could be jazz from the 70s. Could be ambient music from the 60s. Whatever it is, it's new to me, and it's challenging my preconceptions. And I find that like an incredibly rewarding thing to do. But, I think music has the capacity for the sublime. I was talking to my dad about this the other day, and actually talking about how I've been trying to understand classical music, which has never been a preoccupation of mine. But I found it very sentimental and very inauthentic. And he was like, well, no.
You found classical music?
I find most classical music within the European romantic tradition very, very, full of artifice. It just doesn't speak to me.
Yeah.
Bach I love, and I love a lot of contemporary, more minimalistic 20th century classical music, but Mozart, Beethoven, I've never formed a connection to. My dad was like, no, you've got to listen to it live. You've got to go and you've got to sit in that auditorium and feel it. You've got to feel it. You can't understand it from listening to it through speakers, unless it's a huge sound system. It's got to be felt. And he's right. I then did, and I was enraptured. Utterly enraptured, and I realized that my appreciation of Bach was purely intellectual, and that was what I was kind of dazzled by the incredible intellectual kind of construction of it, but that actually the emotional thing of hearing it played in person just touched bits of my body and mind that I didn't believe were possible. And I suppose it's kind of, this is going to sound really... I remember discovering electronic music as a teenager, which had... I grew up as a teenager just listening to like punk and rap probably, and never really had much taste for electronic music until I remember, going to a rave at the age of about 16, 17 and being exposed to proper techno music for the first time on a really good sound system, and just hearing levels of music that I just didn't know were possible.
What sort of techno do you like?
I like all sorts of techno, and I like all sorts of electronic music now. I have a kind of voracious appetite for electronic music, but I also listen to it less and less because I only really enjoy it on a very big sound system in a club, and I enjoy it around other bodies. I don't really listen. I don't enjoy it nearly as much on headphones. So it's less a part of my life these days. But I think music has the capacity for the sublime. Art has the capacity to provoke the sublime in us. Poetry, has the capacity to provoke the sublime in us. And again, yeah, I think nature does. I think, I think to sit and gaze out at the sun as it sets over the horizon is to be confronted with both your incredible significance and insignificance at exactly the same moment in a way which is impossible to fully comprehend. Yes, and that gives you a whisper of the sense of kind of what the true reality of existence is. And that's what I'm constantly seeking. But it is not in food for me.
Wow.
Food is fuel. Fuel is sustenance. It is emotional fuel. It is deeply human. The sublime is inhuman. It comes from completely outside of us.
Wow. Just personal question here. What are some of your favourite books? Because I want to just personally go and read them, or like some that you think are pretty profound that you'd recommend. It could be fiction.
I recently reread a book called The Transit of Venus by Shirley Hazard, who is an Australian writer who lived most of her life in New York, and I think is the most incredible prose stylist. And it is a very good book. It's a very, very incredibly astute, intelligent book about the impossibility of love between intelligent people. And for me, it's a very good book to read if you're emerging from adolescence into adulthood. Into true adulthood, and can no longer, the possibility of falling in love with total abandon as we're kind of conditioned to understand romantic love is any longer possible. I really liked it because I hadn't read a good piece of, realist fiction, I suppose, for a very long time. I'd read a lot of, more ambitious experimental stuff, a lot of contemporary, first person stuff, but, just a kind of a straightforward narrative framed around the impossible love between two complicated individuals, and the whole, a very, very uninhibitedly straightforward attempt to account for the reality of human experience via multiple voices was so refreshing and rewarding and brilliant, and I loved it. I really, really enjoyed it, and it actually started me reading fiction again for the pleasure of reading fiction in a way that I probably had been forcing myself to read interesting fiction and contemporary fiction, especially a lot of things in translation, which I find often at the moment more inspiring and more interesting than a lot of contemporary stuff published in English. But nevertheless, this book kind of really gave me a taste for 20th century English language literature again. And I heartily recommend it to anyone.
Final question, because I know you're about to open, but what's one truth you believe that most people would disagree with you on?
I don't think I particularly believe anything. First of all, I think there are very few truths. There are very few things that I believe to be fundamentally true. And I think that most of the things that I believe to be true, were they expressed in simple terms, would sound incredibly banal. Make your life about service to other people. Love yourself, love the people around you disinhibitedly. This will give you, figure out what you believe is right and wrong, and then live by it scrupulously. These are the kind of fundamental principles that I try and live by, that I think are the kind of nature of a good life, a life worth living, and a life where you will ultimately be of more service to people around you than you can expect in return. But you should expect in return, because by doing good, you spread good that will come back to you. I believe that. And I believe that only through that optimistic vision of shared human living will we build a better world. I am, a committed utopian, even though I have no theoretical framework which I can kind of sensibly construct that. I do believe a better world is possible, and I will never stop wanting to believe that, and I will never stop being committed to that idea, even if it's only just because it gives me the hope necessary to carry on.
I absolutely love that.